In May 1998, a quiet suburban night in Lubbock, Texas, erupted into unthinkable violence. Inside the Yowell family home, 43-year-old Michael John Yowell, troubled, addicted, and spiraling, turned on the very people who gave him life. What began as an attempt to steal money for drugs ended in horror. Michael shot his father in the head, strangled his mother with a lamp cord, and then opened a gas line that would later ignite, killing his elderly grandmother in a massive explosion. The crime shocked Texas, not only for its brutality, but because it was carried out by their own son and grandson. And what made it even more haunting was Michael's long history of mental illness, violent outbursts, and cries for help that went unanswered. In the end, his actions left 3 family members dead, a community devastated, and a legal battle that would stretch for 15 years, ending in Huntsville, Texas with one chilling phrase, "Punch the button." To understand how addiction, mental illness, and violence collided in one of Texas's most disturbing family murders, and to hear the last words of Michael John Yowell before his execution, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon, because this is the kind of case that lingers long after the story fades to black. Michael John Yowell was born on January 25, 1970, and was raised in Lubbock, Texas, in what appeared on the surface to be a stable, middle-class household. His parents, John and Carol Yowell, worked hard to provide for their family, instilling discipline and traditional values in their home, while caring for Michael and his siblings with the hopes that he would one day find a steady path in life. By all outward appearances, the Yowells lived the quiet, respectable life of an ordinary Texas family, but behind closed doors, Michael's struggles began to surface early. As a child, he exhibited signs of instability, frequent behavioral problems, difficulty in school, and an inability to control his impulses. By adolescence, these issues were compounded by a growing dependency on drugs, which quickly spiraled into an addiction that he carried into adulthood. Psychiatric evaluations later revealed that Michael suffered from a long list of diagnoses: borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and antisocial personality disorder, conditions that often left him violent, unpredictable, and detached from reality. Friends and family recalled his disturbing admissions that he sometimes heard voices, experienced psychotic episodes, and entertained both suicidal and homicidal ideations. His descent into addiction and untreated mental illness became the defining struggle of his life. As the years passed, Michael began racking up a criminal record that reflected his downward spiral. He was convicted of burglary of a building and possession of a controlled substance, serving time under probationary terms. His probation officer would later testify that Yowell had been placed in multiple programs designed to treat both his drug dependency and mental health disorders, yet he failed to complete them. His life became a cycle of release, relapse, and reoffense. At one point, he was even released to a halfway house in the hope that structured living might steer him towards stability, but it was not enough to contain the storm that was brewing inside him. By early 1998, just months before the capital crime, his troubles deepened further. Court records show that Yowell had been reported for violating the terms of his parole with a string of new offenses, including forgery, stolen checks, and the illegal use of credit cards. Perhaps most alarming of all, despite being a convicted felon, Yowell had somehow managed to exploit loopholes to purchase prohibited firearms from 3 separate stores. He used his own mother's credit card to buy these weapons and falsified information to either acquire or pawn them, all while battling his escalating drug habit. Jurors at his trial also learned about the shocking betrayal of trust that occurred within his own home. Just 5 days before the murders, Michael Yowell signed a written statement confessing that he had been stealing directly from his mother, writing forged checks and illegally charging her credit cards to fuel his addictions and reckless lifestyle. This pattern of theft and deceit, committed against the very people who supported him, would soon escalate into violence of unimaginable proportions. By the spring of 1998, Michael John Yowell was a man at the edge, mentally unstable, addicted, financially desperate, and legally entangled in violations that made his future look bleak. The foundation of his family's love, which had carried him for years, was beginning to crumble under the weight of his crimes. And in just a matter of weeks, the Yowell household, a place that once represented safety and stability, would become the scene of one of the most brutal family murders in Texas history. It was the night of May 19, 1998, when 28-year-old Michael John Yowell, consumed by desperation and trapped in the grip of a $200 a day drug habit, returned to the one place that had always sheltered him, his parents' home in Lubbock, Texas. But this night was different. Michael wasn't coming home to reconnect, to seek comfort, or to ask for help. He came with one goal in mind: to take money, any money he could find to feed his addiction. Inside the quiet house, his father, Johnny Yowell, then 55 years old, caught him in the act, rifling through his wallet in search of cash. A confrontation erupted, father against son. Johnny, disciplined and principled, had likely confronted his son countless times before about his drug use and criminal behavior, but this night the confrontation would be his last. In an instant of violence and desperation, Michael raised a gun and shot his father in the head, ending his life within seconds and shattering the safety of the Yowell home forever. The sound of the gunshot brought Carol Yowell, 53, rushing into the room. A devoted mother and a woman who had stood by her troubled son for years, Carol's instinct was to respond, to help, to protect, but she ran straight into Michael's rage. In a frenzy, Michael attacked her, beating her before wrapping the cord of a lamp around her neck. With cold determination, he pulled until she stopped struggling, strangling the life out of the woman who had once carried him, loved him, and defended him when the world gave up. Within minutes, both of his parents, two pillars of kindness, community, and family, were gone. But Michael wasn't finished. In an attempt to cover his crime, he walked into the kitchen, turned on a natural gas valve and fled the home. What he left behind was a deadly trap, a house filling with gas, a time bomb waiting to ignite. Lying lifeless inside were the bodies of his parents. But also inside was someone he seemed not to consider, or worse, someone he simply didn't care about, his 89-year-old grandmother Viola Davis. Viola was frail, disabled, and unable to escape the growing danger. When the explosion ripped through the house, the walls buckled, flames tore across the rooms, and everything that John and Carol had built was consumed in fire. Viola miraculously survived the initial blast, but her injuries were severe. She clung to life for several days before finally succumbing to the burns and trauma, becoming the third victim of her grandson's violence. Meanwhile, Michael fled into the night. In a calculated effort to erase evidence, he stashed the murder weapon in the crawl space of a friend's house, discarded his blood-stained clothing, and scrubbed his hands and belongings with bleach in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. But the evidence was too great, the destruction too visible, and the truth too horrifying to hide. The murders of John and Carol Yowell, followed by the slow death of Viola Davis, were not random acts of violence committed by a stranger in the night. They were acts of ultimate betrayal, carried out by the very son and grandson they had once loved and protected. A family was obliterated, not by fate, not by accident, but by blood, by one of their own. And the reverberations of that crime would be felt for years, as the community of Lubbock and eventually the state of Texas grappled with how to punish a man who destroyed the very people who had given him life. As the dust of the horrific crime began to settle, investigators were piecing together the chain of events that had shattered an entire family. Just days after the murders, Michael John Yowell, once seen as a troubled but harmless man in the Lubbock community, finally broke under the weight of his guilt and the relentless pressure of the ongoing investigation. He confessed to the unthinkable, that it was indeed he who had brutally taken the lives of his own father, John Yowell, his mother, Carol Yowell, and indirectly, through the house fire, caused the death of his frail, 89-year-old grandmother who had shared their home. And when investigators searched, they found the hidden gun exactly where he said it would be. That confession marked the beginning of one of Lubbock's most disturbing criminal trials, a case that would ultimately shock not just the local community but the entire state of Texas. Prosecutors quickly filed capital murder charges, not just for the vicious stabbing deaths of John and Carol but also for the grandmother's tragic death in the blaze Michael himself had set in an effort to conceal his crimes. The stakes could not have been higher. A conviction meant only two possible outcomes: life imprisonment without parole or death by lethal injection. The courtroom soon became the stage for a fierce battle between the prosecution and the defense, with Michael's fate hanging precariously in the balance. The defense team moved quickly to construct a case around Michael's mental instability, pleading insanity. They argued that his long and well-documented history of psychiatric problems, substance abuse, and erratic behavior proved he was not fully in control of his actions that night. Expert witnesses were called to describe his deteriorating state of mind, citing episodes of delusion, depression, and instability that had haunted him for years. They painted the portrait of a man consumed by inner demons, whose descent into drugs and mental illness had driven him to commit crimes that otherwise, in a rational state of mind, he would never have considered. Their plea was simple but desperate. Michael Yowell was not a cold-blooded killer, but a deeply disturbed individual who needed treatment, not execution. The prosecution, however, had an entirely different picture to show the jury. To them, this was not the story of a man who lost control but rather of someone who meticulously carried out a set of deliberate, calculated, and almost ritualistic killings. They pointed to the sheer brutality of the killings, the premeditation involved in attacking both parents, and his grandmother, elderly, fragile and unable to escape on her own, was inside when the house exploded. They argued this was an attempt to destroy evidence and cover up his crimes, which only underscored his awareness of what he had done. The jurors listened intently as prosecutors detailed every violent strike, every act of concealment, and every cold calculation. They reminded the jury that John and Carol were not just names on paper but beloved community members, a father who had worked tirelessly to provide stability for his family, and a mother who had devoted herself to nurturing others, both within her family and her church. The murder of such selfless individuals, they emphasized, was not only a crime against the victims but an affront to the moral foundation of society itself. As the trial moved into its final days, the courtroom grew heavier with emotion. Surviving relatives, siblings, extended family and friends were called upon to give victim impact statements. Their words cut through the legal jargon and courtroom procedure, laying bare the raw devastation Michael's actions had caused. They spoke of the immeasurable pain of losing not just one, but 3 cherished family members, the sleepless nights, the haunting images of that fire, and the cruel realization that their loved ones had been betrayed by their very own flesh and blood. Some cried openly on the stand, others spoke with a trembling voice, and a few barely managed to hold themselves together. Each statement was a reminder that behind the headlines and the courtroom drama were real people, real families, and real grief. In the end, the jury's decision was swift but heavy with significance. After weighing the evidence, the defense's pleas for mercy, and the prosecution's relentless depiction of Michael as a remorseless murderer, they reached their conclusion. Michael John Yowell was guilty of capital murder. And with that verdict came the inevitable sentence that had loomed over the entire trial: death by lethal injection. It was 1999 when the gavel came down and the judge announced the final sentence, sealing Michael's fate and closing one of the darkest chapters in Lubbock's history. For some in the community, justice had been served. A killer held accountable for the unspeakable destruction of his own family. For others, the trial was a haunting reminder of how mental illness, substance abuse, and familial conflict can collide in the most tragic of ways. But regardless of perspective, one thing was certain. Michael Yowell's trial left scars that would never heal, both in his family and in the hearts of those who had watched the case unfold. After Michael John Yowell's conviction and death sentence, his defense team immediately launched a series of appeals, hoping to overturn or at least delay his execution. One of the primary arguments put forward was centered on Yowell's long-documented history of mental illness. His attorneys insisted that his struggles with severe drug addiction, combined with a deteriorating psychological state, impaired his ability to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions. They claimed that these factors were not properly addressed during the trial, and that his mental health should have weighed more heavily against the imposition of the death penalty. Alongside this, his defense alleged that he had received ineffective legal counsel at earlier stages, suggesting that vital mitigating evidence had not been presented to the jury in its entirety. Despite these assertions, the appeals did not gain the traction his defense team had hoped for. Federal courts reviewed the case multiple times, but each time the outcome remained the same. They concluded that Yowell had been fully aware of his actions when he murdered his parents and grandmother in 1998. Judges emphasized that while his substance abuse and psychological struggles were concerning, they did not absolve him of responsibility for the brutal crimes he had committed. The courts maintained that the original trial had been conducted fairly and that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the jury's decision. In the years leading up to his scheduled execution, Yowell's attorneys also sought to challenge the state of Texas over its use of lethal injection drugs. They argued that the drugs being used in executions were often sourced from questionable suppliers, lacked proper regulation, and carried a risk of causing unconstitutional pain and suffering. This legal challenge was part of a broader wave of appeals being filed across the country at the time, as many death row inmates and their advocates raised concerns about the secrecy and reliability of lethal injection protocols. Yowell's legal team pushed this argument to the forefront, filing urgent requests for stays of execution while the issue was under national scrutiny. However, these efforts ultimately fell short. The U.S. Supreme Court, the highest authority that could intervene, reviewed the filings but declined to halt Yowell's execution. Their refusal sent a clear message. Despite growing debates over lethal injection methods, Yowell's case would not be delayed. With that decision, all legal avenues were exhausted, and the date with death that had loomed over him for years was now certain. On the morning of October 9, 2013, Michael John Yowell was awakened early inside his cell at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. where Texas death row inmates are housed in isolation. He had spent more than 14 years on death row, his appeals exhausted, and this was the day his sentence would be carried out. At dawn, officers arrived to escort him through the highly controlled transfer procedure reserved only for condemned prisoners. Shackled hand and foot, he was placed inside a secure transport van and driven under tight security to the Huntsville unit, also known as the Walls Unit, a place infamous for hosting the state's executions. This red brick prison has witnessed the final moments of hundreds of men and women sentenced under Texas law, and on that day, it would become the final stop in Yowell's troubled and violent life. By the time he arrived at Huntsville, a sense of inevitability had settled in. As per prison protocol, Yowell was given the option of a final meal, but Texas had abolished the practice of offering condemned inmates a special last meal 2 years earlier, in 2011, after a high-profile controversy. Instead, Yowell was served the same institutional food offered to every other prisoner that day. There was no lavish spread, no comfort food of choice, just the routine cafeteria-style meal, a stark reminder that in death as in life behind bars, individuality had been stripped away. Hours ticked by as Yowell was placed in a holding cell near the death chamber. He was allowed brief visits with his spiritual advisor and given the chance to meet with prison officials for final formalities. Outside the prison walls, protesters and victim advocates had gathered, some holding candles in solemn vigil, others demanding justice for the brutal slaying of his parents. Inside, family members of the victims prepared to watch the execution, their emotions heavy with decades of grief. When the appointed hour arrived, Yowell was led into the execution chamber, a sterile, brightly lit room dominated by a gurney with heavy leather straps. Prison officers secured him to the table, binding his arms and legs as he stared up at the ceiling. Witnesses, separated by glass, filled the viewing areas. On one side sat his victims' relatives, on the other, Yowell's chosen witnesses, including members of his family. A microphone was lowered near his mouth, giving him one final chance to speak. His voice trembled with raw emotion as he addressed those closest to him. Looking toward his daughters, Mandy and Tiffany, and his ex-wife, he said, "I love you." Then, in a chilling and spiteful twist, he directed venom toward a man named Gerald, bitterly calling him a zero. Turning back to his loved ones, he added, "I love you, Mandy. Tiffany, I love you too." His last words were not a prayer or a plea for forgiveness, but a curt, almost defiant statement to the execution team, "Punch the button." At that command, the warden gave the signal. The lethal injection process began as a single drug, pentobarbital, flowed through the intravenous lines into Yowell's veins. Within moments, his body visibly reacted. His chest rose and fell sharply, his face tightened, and then he slipped into unconsciousness. Witnesses reported that he gasped a few times before becoming completely still. The process stretched on for 19 minutes, far longer than most executions, as the powerful sedative slowly shut down his body's functions. Finally, at 7:11 p.m., Michael John Yowell was officially pronounced dead. If you've stayed with me through the chilling and tragic story of Michael John Yowell, from the troubled beginnings, the horrific crime, the lengthy appeals, and finally, his last words in execution, you now know just how complex, dark, and thought-provoking this case truly was. Stories like this remind us of the thin line between justice, tragedy, and human failure, and they often leave us questioning the very system and the choices people make. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you believe justice was truly served here, or do you think there could have been another path? Let's keep this conversation going in the comments below, because your perspective matters. If you found this story engaging, don't forget to hit the like button to support the channel, share this video with others who might be interested in true crime and justice stories, and of course subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss out on more deep dives like this one. And remember to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when new content drops. This case was both heartbreaking and disturbing, but by discussing it together, we shed light on the realities of crime, punishment, and the human stories behind them. So drop your comments, share your views, and let's engage, because your voice is what keeps this community alive.